Hi guys, and welcome back to Scalemotor. So today we're going to be carrying on with our Tamiya YZR-M105, the Rossi bike, and it's going to be part 2B, or not 2B. We're going to be I'm going to be going into more detail about the Top Studio chain set. Now, as you can see on the side, it does say silver. There are two separate ones. There is a gold version, and the gold version is the one I needed for this bike. But I bought the silver one. Not too much of a problem. I can, well, what we did is we painted the links. So there we go. I'm just going to look through the box. Here are the instructions. Quite detailed instructions. You know, they go through what you need to do pretty well, but sometimes a video can help. Here we've got the jig, which is going to help us put everything together. In here we've got our roller pins for the chain, some solder and some metal pieces, and nuts and bolts. You've got the links. These links are two separate links, two separate types, so don't get them mixed up. And here's the Sprocket PE stuff. So first up, we are going to be cutting the bits off the fret to make our sprockets. There was, I think it was 4 pieces altogether for the rear sprocket, 5 I think for the rear sprocket, and that's not including the bolts, which you've got to make using solder and photoetch. I'd suggest using a hard surface and a pretty sharp knife to get these off. I was using the cutting mat and an old knife, which is why it took me ages. But once they're off, they need a little bit of cleanup. So I'm just using the Tamiya basic files to go in and just file away any remaining bits. Mounted them on a cocktail stick. You can see I've got one little bit of PE there ready, and all we're going to do is we're going to come in with some CA glue. When I can find it, there we go, using the Rocket Rapid CA gel. And we're just going to get a toothpick and get a tiny little bit of glue and blob it on our bit of PE, just enough to hold it. You don't want too much because it can bleed out to the sides. And then all we're going to do is push this down using the cocktail stick to center it, and then it should stick very nicely. Give it a little push and we are centered. Now, we couldn't use the cocktail stick to center the sprockets because there is a bigger opening in the middle. So what we're doing is we're using the solder that came with it, the kit, and we're going to put this through the bolt holes, and then we're going to use this to line up our sprockets. We're going to make sure our PE is the right way around, and we're just going to slide it on and making sure we're going through the same holes as the previous piece, and just pushing it down to make sure it does line up, and we can see that worked nicely. So we're just going to pull that off a bit, and again we're going to come in with a little bit of CA glue, and we're just going to be a little bit careful here because there are areas where the CA glue will be seen through, and we don't want to put too much on. But once the CA glue's on, we're just going to push that photoetch piece down and get it connected. And then we're going to come in and do the exact same thing with the second piece of the sprocket. And we just really want this to line up with the piece underneath, otherwise the chain won't fit properly. The gaps in between the teeth are the specific size for the rollers, as with any chain set, real or 1/1 or 1/12. So if you're even slightly out, you can have issues with fitment of the chain, or the chain won't turn, or will get stuck. So just be really careful of this part, which is why we're using that solder to to help locate that piece of photoetch. Now to squeeze with our fingernails just to make sure it is sitting nicely. Now this CA glue does set rather quickly, so you just want to be careful of that. I may look at using a glue with a longer working time just to make sure we get things stuck in the right place, because it has caught me off guard once or twice and I've had to kind of use a craft knife to gently pry the pieces apart, give them a sand to get any CA glue off, and then re-glue. But we're going to do the same thing for the front sprocket. Now this is just 2 pieces, so we're just going to pop a little bit of CA glue in between the holes. Not too much, because it can dry thick, and that'll leave a gap and it'll make the part the wrong size, which we want to avoid, obviously, because we need it a very specific size for that chain to work. So next up, we're going to be moving on to the sprocket bolts. I guess they're shafts and nuts, rather. And these are just 3 little tiny pieces of PE which sit on this solder line. And the easiest way I've found to do this is make sure it fits first, and then put a tiny blob of the CA glue on and push the PE part down till it just touches that CA, and that should hold it in place lovely. And then you do it again for the next piece and slightly push that on top of the first PE piece, and so on. And we want to leave a little bit of this solder protruding out of the top of these 2 photo etch pieces, because that will simulate the shaft which the nut sits on to hold the sprocket in place. A tiny bit of CA there, and then give it the second piece of photo etch a push down. And then to attach it to the sprocket, it's super simple. I did put a bit of CA glue on first, but I don't think I put very much on. So what we're doing now is we're just going to post this through one of the holes and put it down. I realised when I put that first bit of CA glue on that it wasn't much and it wasn't going to hold, so I pulled this down just to test fit it. Make sure it sit nice and flush. And then I just give it a little bit of push off. You see there was a tiny bit of hold with that super glue. But now we're just going to put another little, ever so small little dab on, because we don't want it to bleed out of the side of these PE parts, because it'll just look like a frosty blob, which we want to avoid because we want to try and retain as much detail as possible. Just going to push it down, make sure that's in place, and then once it is in place, you can just come in with your side cutters, give it a snip, because it's solder, it's nice and soft, and then we just had to do 4 more. Okay, and now we are making the shaft for the front sprocket. And this came as a metal piece and 2 PE flanges, I suppose, which sit on top. And essentially what this shaft does, it goes through the center of our photo etched front sprocket. And you can see you've got the 2 flanges there which stop it sliding through the sprocket, and the sprocket will rotate around this shaft. And we are supposed to put a little bit of glue on the end once we've finally seated that in place, so the shaft stays still and the sprocket turns. But before we fit that, we're going to go on to fit the rear sprocket. Now, there were little bits of solder protruding out of the back which we had to take care of. So first of all, after the first test fit, we give it a little snip, and then once we've snipped away these, we'll test fit it again. This is the importance, I think, of test fitting, because you don't want to add glue to this, think it's going to fit, pop it on, and then it's completely out of whack. and you have to pry it off and break something or chip paint. So yeah, so we test fitted again, and again it wasn't the greatest fit. So we just came in with our Tamiya basic files yet again, and we're just going to file away that solder. The solder file's super simple, so it doesn't take too long to do this. I'm not going to show it all though, but once we're all filed away, we can see another test fit before we go, and it looks like we're all good to go. There's a PE circle on the back side of the sprocket, which fits in that hole in the center of the wheel. So what we're going to do is we're going to put some CA glue down in the hole just on the edge, so it just catches the ends of that piece of photo etch. Because if we put it on the mate-in face, we could change the fitment, and it could, you know, it could go on wonky. So we want the mate-in faces to sit flush to each other. And then once we've got that stuck on, it's a simple case of just adding it to the bike. Now with the filler and stuff I put on this this swing arm, I think it has kind of closed up ever so slightly, so I did have to slightly pry. If this is the case and you do have to slightly pry when you're doing it, just be very careful. You don't want to knock any bits off, you don't want to snap anything, but it should go in nicely with a little bit of force. And once we got that wheel all attached, we had to make a hole for the front sprocket. Now you can see where it fits, and what we done was we just drilled a hole with the biggest drill bit I had to hand, which is a 1.5mm, and then we used the Tamiya basic files just to file it out. And then what we're going to do is we're going to keep test fitting this shaft we made earlier. We want it to be a snug fit, so the sprocket will rotate around this shaft and the shaft won't turn. I'm not sure if this is the correct way to do it. I'm not sure if that shaft does need to turn, but I found that this was the easier way to get it done. So after the test fitting, we can see that we are good. And we're just going to test fit it with the sprocket on 2. Just make sure it sits nicely and it's not interfering with anything. And then we should be all good on the front sprocket. There we go, you can see it does spin, and the shaft doesn't wobble around too much in that hole, which is great. Okay, so next up is building the jig, and this is super simple following the instructions. This first part we're going to work on is the top part of the jig, which clamps everything in place. We're just going to put a little bit of CA glue on, and then we're just going to grab the other piece and just make sure it's lined up nicely, and then once it is, give it a little squeeze down, and we're good to go on that piece. That's the first part of the jig out of the way, nice and simple. Then the main body of the jig is built up. It starts with these two pieces, which again just fit together like this, like the first piece. This doesn't call out for CA, I don't think, but I'm going to add a little bit of CA anyway, just because the previous one I built did start to fall apart, so CA glue will help. And as you can see, I did glue it on the wrong way first, which is why there's those frosty blobs. But there we go. Again, nice and simple. For the next piece, there are bits on the outside which go on. So what I'm using here is the screws that come with the chain set, just to make sure that the outside pieces line up nicely. It can be a little fiddly, the screws, so I'm just going to give them a little push in. And then once we've got those outside pieces on, we use a piece of solder through the 3 holes on the front. I've left about 2mm protruding out the back, and then I'm going to get my snippers and I'm going to leave about 2mm protruding off here. Just center it up, and then we're going to use some flat nose pliers just to give it a squeeze, and this should make like a rivet, I suppose, where the ends are peened over, and it should hold it together nicely. You may find it protrudes a little too much after that, so you can go in and give it a file. But again, super simple, just follow the instructions and you'll be good. So next up, we've got two separate types of links. One has been painted gold, and they're going to be our outer links, and the silver links are going to be our inner links. So each of these needs to be snipped off the fret, and then what we're going to be doing is using a small piece of brass rod. I forget the diameter, unfortunately. However, if you've got some brass rod laying around, you can just give it a go and see what works best. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pick up each plate of the chain, and we're going to add it to this piece of brass with the point which connected to the PE fret pointing upwards. And then we're just going to hold the length of them like this, come in with a file and clean up those ends. You don't have to do this, but once you look at the final chain, any bits which haven't been sanded off like this, you can spot, and sometimes it can impede the smooth running of the actual chain, and it can kind of bind up if you've got 2 points facing each other. So next, I'm using a table vise. This is just clamped on to the end of the table, and we're clamping our jig in, and we're adding the roller pins. Now, I did not leave a gap on the first one. You're supposed to leave a gap on the first one. I did take this out later on. However, for the first couple of parts of the chain, what we want to do is we want to go all the way along. Obviously missing that first section. So they are lettered. They're A to, I can't remember, I think it was V, maybe. However, we want to go along and skip A and get the rest of the letters for the first, I think it's 4 or 5 parts of the chain. It will say in the instructions. Do not use pointed tweezers to do this, because you will end up losing about 50 chain rollers and you have to end up looking for them. But yep, there we go, we got to the end and we've taken that A out on the first one, I believe. And then this is that top piece of the jig we made first, and this just slips in. Now, for this part, what you want to do is you want to get those screws which came with the kit and pop them through those 2 holes we can see on the left, on the right, and this will hold the top of that jig in place. And what it'll do then is it'll hold our rollers in place. And then we're also using the nuts that came with it just to make sure that's clamped in place. And I'm using a 2.5mm socket there, pardon me, which came with the IFixIt screwdriver set. I'll leave a link to that down in the description. It's quite a handy little set for everything, really. But I have found I use it quite a bit with the models. There's little screwdrivers, there's even like kind of picks, so you can poke things, and yeah, I'll leave a link down in the description. But anyway, once we are done there, I've clamped the shafts of the screws down in that vise, just so the jig doesn't fly about everywhere, and we're going to start adding the links. So first up, we're going to be using the silver links, and these have a larger diameter hole so they can go further down on our roller pins. And I'm just using a toothpick to pop them on. So you can wet the end of the toothpick. There's a couple of things you can do. I literally just dab the end on my tongue, and it'll pick these PE plates up, no problem. So we want everything covered at this point. We want to go from A to V, I think it is. So you want to put a gap. You want to bridge the gaps between our pins all the way along. And next up then, we're going to go over the top and we're going to add our gold links. Now, with this, you want to skip A and then you want to go as far along as you can go. Actually, I can see, looking at this, I've done this backwards. So I can see we've got A on the right hand side. But anyway, what you're going to want to do is you want to skip the first pin and A and just bridge the middle pins. And I'm using my left hand there just to rest on, just so my right hand isn't flailing around everywhere and knocking links off and ruining everything. So once we're done adding those outside links, all we're going to do is we're going to put on a bit of watered down PVA glue. I use tacky glue from Hobbycraft. You can use PVA, I think wood glue would be fine. Just water it down about 50-50 and then get it on and make sure it kind of goes in between all the links and the pins. I'm just using my left hand to brace the brush to make sure I don't mess anything up. And then we're just going to brush outwards, not upwards or across. And this will keep everything in place, and we're pushing down slightly just to push everything down. And then we're going to leave that glue to set, because that will hold our links on, and we can then flip it over and do the same on the other side. Okay, now once that glue is dried, what we're going to do is we're going to come back and we're going to take our screws, bolts. I'm going to go with bolts because they go through something rather than into something. That's a discussion for a whole different time. What's the difference between a screw and a bolt? But anyway, we're going to be taking them out and then changing the sides. So essentially we're just turning them around in the jig. And the reason we're doing this is there's other parts of the jig which are meant to fit onto the other side so we can continue. Don't skip any of these parts of the jig. You might think, oh, I don't need that, but you do. The reason they're there is to keep the links in place, but not just that. They also make sure that the jig is thick enough so when you come to hammer the pins, you don't hammer them too much. So it's designed to be such a thickness that the pins will be peened over just enough for everything to hold and for the chain to actually work without binding. Okay, once you've struggled with that for 3/4 of an hour, we're going to come on to add these next pieces of the jig that I was talking about. Now, first one that fits on is this one, and it is just it's just got a gap, just a slit going all the way up the middle. And then the next piece that goes on top has got a slightly L shape to it. And this is because once this is on, we need to add one more link, one more outer link, so it's the gold link, to that L-shaped gap on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, sorry, it turns out I was using the wrong one. So essentially there's two sides to the chain. One is going to be with that A side with the pin we missed, and we want to keep that open, and we want the gap on the left hand side where we do have a roller pin, and this will form we're going to do this on both sides, and this will form the outer links, and that'll become, a lot less confusing once we come to join the chains together. But anyway, once we got that on, we need to make sure that link is there, and then we're going to pop this last piece over the top, which has just got holes in. And to be honest, I'm not sure, but I don't think it matters which side this goes on. Refer to your instructions for those center pieces I was playing with just now, because obviously you can see it was quite easy to put it in the wrong place. But just remember that where the gap is, where A is, where we've missed the roller pin, it's the opposite side of the chain we want that extra link to go. Little confusing, but you'll see what I mean once once we get to the end. And now, yet again, we are swapping the screws. and this is so we can do the exact same thing on the other side. Okay, and now we've repeated ourselves all on the other side of the jig. It's time to go ahead and pin the links, not the links, sorry, the pins over. But first things first, we're going to use the other screws that came with the kit, and we're going to put them in the other holes lower to the bottom. This is just because we want the jig to be as tight together as it can be, just to hold any links which might be out of place in place, because once you start hammering, we can end up kind of moving links, or things can vibrate out of place. So we want these bolts, sorry, and these nuts in, and we want it as tight as we can get it. Okay, and once we're done with that, we're going to move on to hammering. Now, I'm just using a the side of an old piece of set of pliers. You can use any hard surface, but just be aware that it needs to be raised because we've got those nuts and bolts in each side. Now you can see I'm just tapping. You don't want to go too hard because you can break things, you can bend the jig. Just kind of slow, methodical taps. And you can see I'm just rubbing along there, and the reason I'm doing that is because you can kind of feel if the pins are flattened. You want them to be nice and flat to the surface of the outside of the jig, and you just want to make sure you get both sides. Just I'd say kind of slow, controlled taps. Try and focus the camera here, and you can see that it's kind of nice and flush. Those pins are with the jig. And this is exactly what we're after. And we're just going to take those screws, those bolts, and those nuts out. This is the best part, because all of that hard work you've done previously will, all comes together when you see this kind of last piece. Until then, you look at it and realise you've got 4 more to do. Lovely. But yeah, there's still be careful at this point, because there might be pieces which haven't peened over well enough. If that is the case, then that's not a problem. What you can do is, once you take off this this top piece of the jig, you'll be able to see if things aren't peened over enough, or if any links are moving. I'd encourage you to have just like a little fiddle with it, just while it's still in the jig with the top piece off, which is the first piece we added after adding the roller pins. Or even at this point, just have a little fiddle, just run your fingers along it, make sure nothing moves in a way it's not supposed to, make sure no links come off, because at this point what you can do is you can pop those outside pieces back on, which we're taking off right now. And just give it another couple of little small taps with the hammer. There's no need to put the outside piece on again if you're doing that. Just be gentle at this point if you do need to fix anything. But from looking, I can see everything looked alright. So we're going to take that off, and then I found the best way to get it off is with some some tweezers, and just use the back end and push down towards your bench, and it should come off really, really nicely. It might be a bit tricky because of the glue, and you might need to give the jig a little wipe. What I find is good to do is, once I've got all the pieces together, just pop them in a little thing of warm water and give them a little bit of a stir just to get that excess glue off. But you can see here we've got a nice movable piece of chain. Okay, as you can see at this point, we are 5 sections of chain in. So the last bit of the chain, you don't do a full section. There's a measurement in the instructions, and it tells you just how long that chain needs to be. So it also tells you to go from a certain point to a certain letter on the jig, which is why it's important to, when you're building the jig, make sure you get those letters on the outside. And I think with this kit, in this case, it was A to J, which is 10 links, I believe. Anyway, don't use that as gospel. Measure it once you've done this. You will see that there were some issues going through following that to the letter. However, I've also learned from my mistakes, and I've used some flat tipped tweezers instead of pointed ones, and these pins go in a billion a billion times easier than previously, and they don't go flying across the room. So as mentioned, what I'm doing here is measuring. Just rough, doesn't have to be exact, just kind of, you just want to make sure you've hit that measurement in the instructions. I would suggest, if you are building this kit, this exact one for the M105, try using one less link than it calls for in the instructions, because you can always add another one. That's not a problem. You can add another link using the jig, but what you can do, but is really hard to do, is taking links away, which you'll probably see later on. Anyway, what we're doing now is we're just joining each section. This can be quite tricky, but essentially what we're doing is, if you think back to the beginning where we left out that roller pin from slot A on the jig, what we're going to be doing now is adding that roller pin in. So we've got our interior links, which will be the silver ones, and we need to kind of get a roller pin in between those. Now, it can be tricky, but what I found is if I grab the roller pin with the pointed tweezers towards the top of the pin, push the bottom of the pin into the bottom link, you can then kind of push it in and squeeze over the top link. And then what we need to do then is, if you remember the other side of the jig where we had the extra outer links without the pin, we just kind of sandwich them on top. And then what I do is I grip it with the tweezers, as you see there, and I just hold it ever so gently, making sure that we roll the ends of the roller pins are down and up, if that makes sense, and then just tap it with a hammer to pin over those links, and then you should see that we've got two pieces of chain joined nicely. And again, we just got to repeat this over and over again. It is a very repetitive task building one of these chain sets. And once we're joined, now's the fun / infuriating part is adding it to the bike. This can be really tricky and very, very fiddly, especially when you're doing it at 8 o'clock in the morning. So essentially all we're going to do at this point is we're just going to post this through the gap in the swing arm and then through the frame, and then it has to come round and go back over the top of the swing arm. Just be careful, just try and like imagine where it would go, because you can end up going the wrong way, and then, you know, yeah, so just look at reference pictures if you're not too clued up on how kind of bike chains work and how, you know, a bike chain would go together. But yeah, I found the easiest way is to just lower it back through the back of the swing arm there, and then up towards the engine, and you can see you can pull it through there, and then around the shaft, or the swing arm axle, should we say, and then just back towards the rear sprocket. Just making sure we've got enough slack to actually get it through nicely. And there we go, we are through. Okay, now join in the actual pieces. There are a couple of ways to do this. I say there's a couple of ways to do this. There's the way it asks for in the instructions, and that says you don't pin anything over, you just literally connect them like you have connected the previous pieces, and leave it be. Now you can do that if you want the chain to be removable. In hindsight, I'm kind of glad I'd done that first, because like I said, I believe that this was one link too long. So yeah, just be very careful. Use a pair of tweezers, or two at this point, to help. Try and kind of minimize any movements, because you don't want to end up pulling things. You don't want to be moving this bike. It might be easier in some sort of jig, but I found that I've got no need for these jigs at the moment. I'm more than happy resting this on the bench. So yeah, essentially once you've got the two pieces connected, just squeeze the plates together with a pair of tweezers, like so, and then it comes to actually fitting it onto the sprockets. Now I found the best way to do this is to fit it onto the rear sprocket, while we don't have the front sprocket connected. Okay, and then next up we were fitting the front sprocket. This can be a little fiddly, but essentially all we're going to do is we're just going to pop the shaft slightly into the hole we created previously, and then we're going to just slide the chain over the front sprocket. Now with a real chain, and in reality, you shouldn't be able to do that if the chain is seated on the rear sprocket. You shouldn't be able to just huck it over. That would indicate the chain is too long. That was my first kind of hint that the chain was a little bit too long. So yeah, if the chain is hooked over both sprockets, you shouldn't be able to pull it off the front sprocket, or you shouldn't be able to pull it off the rear sprocket, because they are tensioned so on a real bike that can't happen. So yeah, that was my first inkling that there was an issue. So what I'm doing here is I'm just loosening the rear wheel slightly using that screwdriver I mentioned earlier, just so we can, turn the wheel and check the operation of the chain. And you'll see that it kind of, once we start to move it, it kind of bounces about and kinks, and it doesn't stick to the sprockets, and that's because it is a little long. So that's why I suggest building it without, with one less link they're called out for. So because we realized it was a little long, what I'm doing here is just disconnecting the chain where we connected it the first time, and luckily we didn't pin anything over. So all I've done is I've closed my tweezers, popped them in between the links, and slowly let go of the tweezers, and that should push the outer links outwards and break the chain. Essentially, that's what it's called, chain breaking. So yeah, and then came the fun part, and we just had to try and remove a link. Now it can be done because the pins are quite soft. It's just you've got to put quite a bit of force to remove the link. And in this case, all we needed to remove was one roller, and one set of inside links. So we had to remove the outside links from that link. It's really hard to explain, and to be honest, I'm surprised I pulled it off. But once you've done that and you've got the correct amount of links, we're just going to go through the same process, but this time I'm going to pin everything over because I believe this is the right length, and at this point, and at the end of the day, if I make it longer, I know it's going to be too long. If I make it shorter, it's definitely going to be too short, so I'm just going to pin them over. And then if I need to modify the hole up front for the front sprocket, then I can go ahead and do that. So we're going to do the exact same method we done before and just squeeze the links over the roller pin. Might be a little harder this time because the roller pin might be slightly peened over. And there we go. Once we've got that on, is it on? Is it on? yeah, there we go. So what I've done now is, like I said, I've decided I'm going to peen it over, and I'll use the jig for this part. You can use the jig for connecting the pieces. I found it's very hit and miss, but I wanted to be certain at this point. So I've put the jig together, and there's gaps at the bottom where you can add your 2 pieces of chain. Your 1 piece of chain. You need to put the link you are joining in this gap, and there's only 2 holes where the roller pins poke through, and then what you can do is you can peen that over like you were doing originally when making the sections of chain. Okay, and as you can see, we are in the jig now, and we're just going to tap it with a hammer just to make sure it's all peened over. Just using the tweezers just to make sure everything is sitting nicely in the jig. And to take it out of the jig, apparently. Yeah, but we should be all peened over now. We should be good to go. Just make sure the chain isn't twisted when you're connecting it. So you want the same, you want the same side of the chain connecting to the same side of the chain. If you know what I mean, the front and the back side need to be right. Because if you've peened it over, you've connected it, and there's a twist in it, there's nothing you can do. You're gonna have to break it, break the chain, and twist it and connect it properly, unfortunately. Okay, and now we're just going to add the front sprocket. Again, we're going to do this first this time because it's a little tighter, so I'm going to do it I'm going to connect the chain at an old school way, which we used to do with push bikes. So we're going to get that front sprocket in and seated where it needs to go, and we're going to get the chain around the front sprocket and kind of on where it needs to go. And there's holes in the front sprocket, which will help kind of use the tweezers to seat that chain in where it needs to be. Again, this is quite fiddly, so use caution and 2 pairs of tweezers in this case, because I cannot get my fingers in there. And there we go. I'm just using our other tweezers to hold the shaft in, so it doesn't slide out. And we're just going to make sure that chain is tight around that front sprocket, and we're going to pull it back so we've got enough kind of play up the back so we can get it on to the rear sprocket. Don't do that. So I pushed too hard on that center shaft, and it pushed it into the engine. We lost that center shaft. I ended up having to use a screw from an old kit, which wasn't much of an issue at all. So all I'm using now to secure that rear sprocket the front sprocket in place is the tweezers. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use, I'm not sure what I was doing. I was looking for the shaft. I was hoping it had fallen through, but no, it's in the engine, and now the bike's a big maraca. I'm just pulling this through, so I've got enough through, and you can see it is spinning above the front sprocket, which is great. Now, I'm just going to hook the chain over the rear sprocket on on the bottom. If I ever get around to doing it, it's a little fiddly, and obviously I'm trying to make sure I'm not pushing too hard with my left hand. The tweezers is just kind of held in place, just holding that sprocket where it needs to go, and then we're gonna hook the chain over the rear sprocket, get it seated in on a couple of teeth, just making sure that there's no twists or anything in the chain. Also, just slowly go around, and you'll see at one point then it'll start to get pretty tight, so then all we do is we turn that wheel slowly. You'll feel it start getting a little tight, but what it'll do is it'll bring around those connected pieces on the bottom to the top, and then we're all connected and the chain is on, and all that's left then is to add the screw, in this case, to the front sprocket. I didn't catch that on video, unfortunately, because at this point I didn't know what I was going to do. But yeah, eventually we got round, we added the screw, and there we go. You can see it there. There we go. So yeah, that's another part of the video done, and that's the Top Studio chain set done. I hope this does help you if you're building your own. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Have a great day and stay safe.